Welcome back to Curiosity. I am Andrew Bass, and I will be your sole host today. Trevor is still anticipating Christmas. We're recording this 3 days beforehand, and he's got a lot on his plate, so we're going to allow him to enjoy that break, and I will try my hand at hosting again. So I have with me today a new face. This is my good friend and former college pastor, Ryan Russell. And I will just hand the baton off to you immediately. Let you introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? Tell us about your life as much as you'd like to, and the work you're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Ryan Russell, and I live in Temple, Texas, which is in Central Texas, north of Austin, about an hour. And I am the teaching pastor at First Baptist Temple here. Just been serving here for about 8 months, I guess, since April. But I'm also a doctorate of ministry student at Northern Seminary, and that's going to come up with some of our discussion today. Northern is in Lisle, Illinois. You spell that Lisle, Lisle. No one would ever guess that, but it's in the Chicago suburbs kind of area, and I'll be talking about a little bit more about that as we go on. But I guess on a personal level, I'm married to Rachel, and we have a son, a 2-year-old named Griffin, and that family takes up a lot of my time, and love being with them as well. So anyway, thanks for having me today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do appreciate you coming on. So, yeah, as Ryan mentioned, he is a Doctor of Ministry candidate, right? Is that the right term to use? Or
Yeah, that's right.
however, a candidate for Doctor of Ministry, and he's been doing that for a few years now. And that's what we want to talk about today. Specifically, I want to get in, and we'll get into this later, Ryan, about what research you're doing, what the Doctor of Ministry degree is, how it differentiates from a PhD, which might be more common of the two terminal degrees that we tend to think of in the world of theology that some people might have more background of, how they differ, how they're similar. And broadly, though, what I want to start with is just the topic of theological research broadly. Like, what is that? What does it mean to do theology? Because I think for a lot of our listeners, that might sound like a silly question, and for some of them, that might be a legitimate one. Like, I I don't understand what that is. Like, what? Why are these people sitting in a desk and reading all of these books and applying all of these methods? And how is that different from a pastor preparing for a sermon? Is it different? Um, is there a difference between a pastor preaching on Sunday and a pastor or a scholar writing a book and doing all this? So I'll just throw that broad question to you and do it with it what you will. But what does it mean to do theology? What is theological research?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in some ways a complicated one, even if it is also simple. I think that in one sense we could say that all of us do theology. Whether we are intending to or thinking about it or not. Like, theology is thinking about God, and along with that, thinking about the world. And so the way that we move through the world is shaped by the beliefs we have about the world and about God. And so, even if, for some of us, our theology is more explicit, like we know what we believe and we're consciously sort of, living out of that belief. And maybe that for others of us, our theology is sort of implicit. We haven't spent a lot of time, behind a desk thinking about, what we believe. And yet we have beliefs about the world and the way that it is. Even if they're not completely thought through, and those beliefs are sort of shaping the way that we move through it. And so, I think that the task of doing theology is I guess, first of all, saying that let's do it intentionally, let's do it on purpose and thoughtfully, so that we can do it better and we can do it more faithfully, and we can have seek integration between the ways that we think and the ways that we live. So, Andrew, I think that's the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think about what does it mean to do theology. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a helpful distinction, right? So theology is not just limited to the like high and mighty
Ivory
thinker with the
tower.
big beard, yeah, sitting in his ivory
Right.
tower. This is something that we all not only can do, but as Christians we have a responsibility to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and so, when it comes to like, pastors and doing theology, um, there's several things that come to mind. And one of them is that uh we how do I say this? In one sense, the gospel, I would say, is the same in all times and all places, as Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, 15, that Christ died according to the scriptures, and he was buried, and he was raised again on the third day. And so, in one sense, like we can say that that is the gospel, and yet in another sense, we can say that the Christ who rose from the grave is has ascended to the right hand of the Father, and he is at work in the world, and he's reconciling all things to himself, right? And so he's at work in the world amongst us. And so, in the one sense, the gospel is about a past event that has occurred and taken place, right? And is kind of the same no matter where you are. But in another sense, like God is alive and on the move, and he's doing things out in the world, and he's has a mission to reconcile all things to himself. And so theology is really this task of discerning, like, what is God up to in the middle of my context? Like, what is he up to right here where I live, in my local place, and in the circles I inhabit, and in the community that I'm immersed in? And so how is the gospel taking root and taking shape in the particular places that I live? And so, that's really what a pastor is called to do, in my perspective, is to see what the gospel is in their particular community, and to help people live out that gospel, that good news, in their particular places that they are. Yeah, so that's one of the ways I think about what doing theology means. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that points to another thing that I want to talk about. And maybe you've got some more insight. You already said a lot of good there. Is that a lot of times we can think like, okay, well, the Bible has been around for 2,000 years. Um, Everyone smarter than you and I has already, marked it from cover to cover, right? From Genesis to
Right.
Revelation. Hasn't everything already been done? Hasn't everything been thought of? And I think you already shed some light on that. Well, no, because we're still living, right? Like we are still
Yeah.
existing as a church right now in a unique situation that has never existed before and won't exist in the future. So,
Exactly.
yeah, if you have
Yeah.
any more thoughts you want to share on that.
I do, I do. So, I mean, yeah, when your grandma, has pulls out her Bible, and she's had since 1962, and every third word is highlighted, and she's got the notation of when she heard the sermon on that particular passage from 1971, and you think, man, I mean, everything has been said that can be said at this point, right? But in reality, that's not the case, and I think one of the reasons for that is just simply the idea that we part of being human is that we see the world through our particular lens that we've been given, the culture that we have. And so that's not something that we can sort of take off or remove. And so when we study history, this becomes really evident. So, for example, I love the reformers, and I'm deeply grateful for them. We also know that when Luther is writing, that he wrote from within a particular context, of reacting against the Catholic Church and sort of the atrocities that were happening in that particular moment, that he felt compelled to react against. And so his theology doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in reaction against the circumstances that were right in front of him, right?
Mhm.
And in the same way, even to kind of use a non-theological example, Descartes is often talked about as like the father of modernity, right? He thinks like, he has this phrase, "I think, therefore I am." And so he's like, the father of modern objectivity, the idea that we can kind of develop objective truth. And yet there's a lot of books now that talk about Descartes' own context, and how he was driven to the thinking that he had by his own anxiety about what was happening in his own socio-political situation. And so here's this guy who's claiming this objectivity, if as if he's doing, again, thinking in a vacuum, and yet there were factors right around him that were leading him to think the way that he was. And so it's like we always come to the table with a cultural lens that we may or may not sort of be aware of. Um, and that doesn't mean that everything's relative and we all have to throw it out, not at all. But it just means that we're getting a picture, of Christ and his kingdom. But it's always filtered through something, And so the way that we sort of overcome that, so to speak, is first of all, it's interaction with the past. And as an Anglican, I think you'll appreciate this, is that we need to be reading, history. We need to be reading all the people who have been reflecting on the Christian tradition for 2,000 years, and we start to realize that our categories are not the same as them. Then we start to realize that they've been asking the same questions, but perhaps in different ways, and there's different historical factors that have led to the answers they've given, and there's also going to be different historical factors that are leading to the answers that we're giving today as well. We start to realize that our theology always kind of happens alongside and through culture, and maybe that's okay. Um, and then one of the other ways that we overcome that is just by interacting with people of other perspectives in our world today. So when we interact with those who have come from different continents, different languages, different worldviews, different socioeconomic statuses, different ethnicities, etc., we start to see that they're seeing the world in a different way than we are. They have different readings of the Bible than perhaps we do. Um, and all of a sudden, what we start to realize is uh, that we have some of the pieces of the puzzle, but they have some other pieces of the puzzle, and that really, in order to get the complete picture of who Christ is, that we need to be bringing all of our pieces together throughout time, throughout space, and that as we do, then the picture of who Christ is starts to come together in completion. And so that's, I guess, my long answer to that question of like, don't we already know everything? My goodness, no. Like there's a lot that we have learned, and that we have that within our own tradition that we have been told, and yet it's only when that tradition comes in conversation with others that we really gain sort of a bigger perspective.
Yeah, and I think that you hit on a lot of important things there, and there are essentials to the way that we do that, right? Because someone can hear this and think like, okay, so does that mean that Christianity has no dogmatic, like there's no objective, and it's just kind of it changes and evolves? And that's where we come in and say, well, no, Christianity is necessarily a historical religion, right?
Right.
Unlike pretty much every other world religion. Maybe you could make, I mean, Israel and Islam, they would probably jump into our history here, but the different world philosophies, um, other than that, aren't really historical religions. And so for them, maybe that could be a reality. And there are certainly Christians who would say, oh yeah, well, Christian theology is subjective, and maybe take a progressive approach to it. But that's not really what we're saying. At least I don't think
Right.
so. That's not what I would say. We'd
Right.
say, well, no. Step one is recognizing Christianity is a historical religion, and there are these truths that we've inherited that, at the very least, we can say it'd be incredibly unwise for you to accept them, right?
Yeah.
Like the doctrine of the Trinity, right? The
Right.
physical resurrection, the virgin birth of Christ, the God, the deity of Christ. All of these things, as Christians, of course, we have freedom of conscience, but you also don't really have the right. I would say, at least you'd
Yeah.
have to have some introspection and say, do I really think that I carry more weight than the global historical consensus on this? And that's the beauty of Christianity as a historical religion, that we can respond to different things in our culture, different effects, different happenings that are just occurring that are completely unique to our context, and we're not alone, right?
Yeah.
It's not just us in our Bible, or even just us in our congregation, but we have the witness of the church, and that only strengthens in clarity. And I think this is what you're saying. That only strengthens in clarity the more voices throughout the church, both in time
Yeah.
and place, that we have participating in that discussion.
Absolutely. And so, in some ways, like this diversity of voices that you're referring to strengthens, the argument, because,
Hmm.
we can say that across 2,000 years and across, an incredible variety of cultures and places, very different from our own, people have believed these sort of core beliefs that you described, and they have held on to them, despite all the differences that the history of the church provides us, and that really ought to be a sort of a compelling argument for its coherency,
Hmm.
um, is that diversity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of one guy I'm really into is Mike Bird, and it's not just because he's an Anglican, but I like his book Evangelical Theology is awesome. It was one of my textbooks here at Southeastern. That's actually how I started reading his work, and I wish I remembered the title now, but there's another book where he dedicates a chapter. It's either him or Reese Bezant, I think, and that's one of his contemporaries at Ridley College, where they write about this idea of Catholicity that we've held on to forever, right? And that's what the Nicene Creed refers to. It's not a new idea. And he just does such a good job explaining how that is strengthened. It doesn't muddle or confuse the core Christian doctrines by incorporating different voices. It
Yeah,
strengthens it and it gives us further
absolutely.
clarity. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I love that. All right. Um, Well, then let's talk about theological research. So
Sure.
we're all doing theology in a sense, and not just in a
Mhm.
vague sense, in a real objective sense. Every Christian is a theologian. Um, but there is also a discipline of theological research. What is that?
Yeah. So, I think what you're referring to is probably more so in a university sort of setting, right?
Mhm.
Um, the idea of, again, trying to think about God in a way that is informed and is in continuation with the tradition of how people have often thought about God, right? And seeks to do that faithfully in a way that honors, the scriptures, the church, the history of the church, and in a way that is effective for sort of offering up, like, witness to God in the world. That's the hope. And so, do you want me to outline kind of the two different approaches? Is that would that be helpful?
Yeah, yeah. Let's move into that.
Great.
Tell me about that. The two approaches.
Yeah, so I mean, at the beginning, Andrew mentioned that there's sort of two terminal or final sort of degrees that people will receive sort of within the theological world. You have the PhD, which obviously is there kind of for every discipline, right? You can get a PhD in sociology or psychology or whatever else. You can get it in theology or religion or New Testament or different places will call them different things. But then there's also the doctorate of ministry degree, which has the fun abbreviation of DMin, which leads to unlimited puns. So
Mhm.
I can always tell people I'm working on my DMin and just get lots of really weird looks. So that really never gets old. But the doctorate of ministry degree, and so the way that I think I would explain this is that the DMin degree is really meant to be more of a practical degree, and that can mean a couple of different things. First of all, when someone is getting a PhD, that is usually their full time sort of endeavor. I mean, they're not also working down the street at the bank 40 hours a week and doing a PhD. Usually, they are immersed in a university setting full time. So they're studying, they're going to class, perhaps they're teaching and grading and things like that come with that as well. But it is their world that they're immersed in for, on average, maybe 5 years or so. The difference with the doctorate of ministry degree is that that is almost never the case. That instead, it's really meant to be done alongside full time work, usually and often in the church, and so it's meant to be done really, for pastors, um, so that they can be sharpening their skills as pastors while they're working within the context of a local church. And so I've been doing mine for the last about 4 years or so, alongside working full time. And so it gets more so the nights and weekends and devoted spurts of time when I really need to focus attention on a upcoming deadline or something like that. But it's not receiving my 40-hour week day to day sort of attention. And so I think that that has a couple implications. First of all, I mean, it's definitely true that the PhD takes more out of you, without a doubt. 5 years of your full attention versus sort of maybe 5 years of your full, 5 years of your part time and sometimes full time attention. Um, but I think that setup is sort of strategic or intentional because the design is that because you're doing sort of practical ministry and theology side by side, hopefully there's this sort of conversation that's happening between the two of them, and hopefully there's sort of this eye towards integration as well, that whatever you're learning needs to sort of have an application in the day to day of what you're doing, sort of in your ministry and your position. So that's great. And so at the end of the day, like the DMin is sort of a practical degree in that it's meant to really have an eye towards very obvious application in ways that are concrete in the church. Whereas a PhD in some scenarios may get into very hyper specialized and specific research that if you're not really in the field, you may be like, what are we even talking about? And hopefully with an even degree, it becomes accessible to more and more people. So there's a little bit of an overview.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know when I think of the difference between the two, um, it kind of does come into the sense of there's a term now that's going around a lot that I really like, theology for the church, doing theology for the church. And that there are countless different ways that you could interpret that. But the idea to me, it seems, when you're committing to a project or a dissertation in a Doctor of Ministry program, yeah, you're finding something that specifically applies to ministry and specifically in a non-abstract way, in a concrete, like, this is what I am doing. This is my
Right.
unique contribution, right? That's the academic word. This is my unique contribution I am making to practice, to ministry practice, and we're going to implement it. And so from my understanding, there's the research you're doing in the Doctor of Ministry that is current research, right? You
Yeah.
are, maybe you're doing field research. I think they would use that term
Yeah.
in sociology, and
Absolutely.
probably, yeah, applies there. So you're working with fresh data and faces that
Yeah.
you can see, whereas opposed. So for me, I'm kind of, well, I just completed my master's thesis, and it was on the English Reformation. I had no fresh data. I was working with new books of people who were just working with the same old information, and trying to provide some perspective onto a very minute thing, and a very small piece of history. And so I think that would probably be one of the major differences for me as an outsider looking in, to say, like, well, the process of research is, like you said, for the PhD, when you're doing this academic deep dive, you're usually reading old stuff, and
Hmm.
you're trying to um, provide some unique perspective that contributes to the study of this old thing, whether it's a theological concept, whether it's a historical setting, or the cause or effect of something. Whereas when you are committed to research in the Doctor of Ministry, you're saying, I want to contribute something that will uniquely help the church now and in the future in a tangible way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes those who work on a PhD will sort of joke that what they're going to write is going to be read by about 12 different people who in it ever who sort of are only hyper specialized in this field. And and I don't want to belittle that, because I think those contributions are still meaningful, and sometimes there is trickle down eventually to the church, but um, it may be a long time later, or in sort of more minute ways. And look, I don't have any sort of notion that what I'm going to be writing here is going to go viral, or like be read by thousands of people. It is most definitely not going to be. I don't know that my like readership reach is really any bigger. But to me, the difference is that what I'm doing has an effect on the way that I'm pastoring, right? And so the fact that I'm I'm learning and changing in a way that's going to affect the way that for the next several decades of my ministry, that will impact the way that I pastor people. And so there is that long sort of standing influence if nowhere else, inside of me, right?
Mm.
Which again gets at that sort of practical aspect that you're talking about. And for that aspect, it's worthwhile. All of them are worthwhile in some way, but that's kind of how I understand it with the DMin. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And one thing, this is just kind of a thought that I've found interesting is and I don't know if you've noticed this, but a lot of seminaries with PhD programs are really pushing this idea of writing for theology for the church. And in some
Yeah.
way, maybe you're probably not going to be able to devote an entire chapter to practical application or maybe even theological integration. But there is this idea that I know just off the top of my head, Decent Divinity just started a program like this. I think theirs is a PhD in theology for the church.
Hmm.
Midwestern Seminary, SBC Seminary in Kentucky, they've got
Mhm.
that's their idea. They actually have an applied theology track for their PhD program, and there are more that, of course, I can't come up with off the top of my head. But there is this kind of movement, at least in the seminary, in
Yeah.
the seminaries, that they are looking for specific candidates, even in their PhD program, and so it kind of shows some borrowing, I guess, or at least a recognition that it can be helpful to think about even these super abstract concepts.
Yeah.
It could be helpful to spend some time thinking about a way that this could practically be used, um,
Sure.
and maybe
Absolutely.
even and used by parishioners or practitioners um, in the church. So that brings me, I want to ask one more question before we get into your research specifically.
Sure.
Um, we've gone over the differences of a PhD and a DMin, and I think we've covered that well. So, what are some strengths that you would say your DMin program has provided you that you don't think you would have found if, let's say, we're both Baylor guys. If you had gone into Baylor's PhD program, what
Yeah.
are some benefits you think that you're getting, whether it's in your seminars, your cohorts, or that you wouldn't be getting otherwise?
Yeah, sure. So, earlier I mentioned that I'm doing this at Northern Seminary, sort of Chicago suburbs area. My bachelor's and master's were both at Baylor slash Truett. So, um, I feel like there was definitely some value in sort of diversifying, the degrees and going somewhere else that would give just different perspectives and everything. Northern is a historically Baptist institution, but has become sort of more generally widely evangelical, in sort of a, perhaps a moderate sense. And, they kind of pull together, some Anabaptist streams of thought, some Anglican streams of thought, believe it or not, Anglican friendly as well. And, and so I think people from a lot of different theological streams have been able to find a home there. And the professor that I'm working with, that really was the reason that I chose Northern in the beginning, is David Fitch, and he's written some books and done podcasts that I had read early on, and found myself just really drawn to his voice and thinking like, all right, this is someone I can learn a lot from, and who I think can really help me take what I'm doing a lot further. One of the things that's really interesting about at least the way they do this program at Northern, is that there's 7 courses that you go through, and they're all, or they're taught by a number of different people. And so Fitch himself teaches a couple of them, but then the other ones were actually taught by different people around the country who they brought in to teach the different seminars. And so Michael Gorman, for example, is a well-respected New Testament scholar who was brought in, and I got to do one with him. Al Roxborough is sort of a respected theologian, sort of in the missional tradition. He's actually an Anglican. Got to take a class with him as well. And so the way the seminars would sort of work is, because remember, full time employee over here, full time pastor, is they would be for a week at a time, where I would need to travel to Chicago and do class for a whole week. And beforehand there would be readings that would be sent in advance. And so for a few months ahead of time, I'm reading a ton of books, writing some papers before class to help make sure I just understand the content. I come ready to sort of discuss it and do something with it. And then you get there, have a week worth of class. There's lecture, there's discussion, there's assignments that come out of that, and then sort of a final paper on the back end of the class that helps sort of land the discussion. And so anyway, so I went to Chicago 7 times, over the course of about 3 years. And I had a cohort of about 15 people from a lot of different denominations. I was one of only maybe 2 Baptists or so, I think.
Oh
So
wow.
we had, everything. We did have an Anglican. We had some in the Nazarene Church. We had some in the Evangelical Covenant Church. We had some non-denominational Disciples of Christ. I'm sure there are others I'm forgetting of, but just sort of all kinds of different traditions, and that I was able to interact with, and also become really close friends with some of these guys as well, which was really special. And so that's kind of how the program works in general. And I loved that model because it allowed me to meet people and really develop friends that I still keep in touch with, across the nation, and maybe who have different, sort of experiences than I do as well. Um, but then also it allowed me to sort of interact with some significant voices and professors and teachers that I would not otherwise really have access to, and that was really cool. So the way that things work, sort of on the back end of the DMin process, and again, every program is a little bit different. So I'm kind of just telling you how it works here at Northern, and even then, Northern has about 3 or 4 different DMin sort of tracks or intensives or focuses. And so this one is contextual theology is what it's called. And that's the one that David Fitch sort of leads. But the way it works in this particular one is that after you've completed the 7 courses and all the, assignments that go with that, then you write a thesis, or we sometimes call it a project or even dissertation. But and we'll get into that in a few minutes, but it's sort of the culmination of everything that you've been doing. So the whole journey to this point has been building and equipping you in order to take on this thesis and get ready to do it. And so that's done completely remotely. It takes people a year or more, in most cases. And then just like you would in sort of a PhD program, you have a supervisor. They read it, ask you to make edits. You end up defending it, and then at that point you can sort of graduate. So I'm at the point where I'm about 75% done writing mine, I would say, and hoping to graduate this coming summer if all goes well. So we will see. But anyway, I guess your question was really about, like, what are some of the reasons or values or reasons to pursue one. Hopefully I've started to answer that.
Hmm.
But I think I would just say also that, again, the whole point of this is to have an emphasis on the church, and that it would be practical and helpful towards my own ministry, and in some sort of concrete way. And I can definitely say that that's been a result of it. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you. That was good. That you definitely answered the question well. So well, let's go into that then. Now I want to talk about what you're doing specifically. I think we've got a good idea of the difference between these two terminal degrees, right? The PhD and what that means, and the doctor of ministry, the DMin, and what that means, and the practical aspect of it. So what are you doing? What is your project on? What are you researching?
Sure. So hopefully, as I answer that question, you'll hear some of the overtones of what we've been talking about kind of coming to life a little bit. Um, the the project really is intended to start with something that we see in our context, either an issue or a problem or a situation or experience that we want to further reflect on, and sort of bring a theological lens to. And so for me, one of the things when I started this, I was still a college pastor a few years ago, and one of the things that I was seeing a whole lot of was just students struggling with mental health. And so I was in Waco at the time at Baylor University, and just felt like I was seeing over and over and over again stories of students who were struggling in that area with anxiety or depression, and sometimes suicidal ideation, etc. And how there was this big sort of question about, what does the church have to say? What do the scriptures have to say to a world that is struggling with mental health? Because the more I dug into it, what I learned is that it wasn't just our little bubble, that this is sort of a national trend going on, that what we're seeing is mental health sort of on the decline, um, within our culture as a whole. And, especially probably in young adult college kind of circles, but certainly not limited to that either. And so I wanted to think about what the church had to say. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you that I consider myself an advocate for therapy. I've benefited from it at times personally, and others in my life have as well. I think that's important and sometimes crucial for people, depending on what they're going through. And yet, there's also a little part of me that has always had some level of suspicion towards therapy as well. My friend joked that she helped me put it in perspective that I'm like 85% for therapy. So 85%. And so the reason for that 15% pause is tied up in what I have sort of come to term like therapeutic culture. Um, and so therapy has this tie to what I might call therapeutic culture, which is the fact that we live in this world today, where there's like this therapeutic ethos or instinct that we live in all around us. And the goal, or the like sort of implicit assumption of this therapeutic culture that we live in, is that we were made to be happy, right? And that the way that I will become happy is by somehow discovering my true self. And so if you think about Abraham Maslow, who's famous for making this like pyramid of needs, right? And food and shelter at the bottom, and at the top of the pyramid, if you remember, is the triangle is self-actualization. So it's this idea that we have fully sort of arrived as humans when we reach our potential, we discover who we are, and we're able to live that out in the world, right? And within the world of psychology, that's sort of an inward journey that we go in to discover what's there underneath us, so that we can become all that we are to be. And so this idea of like therapeutic culture starts to shape how we think about life as a whole. The writings in therapeutic culture talk about how uh, you know the therapeutic dimension sort of shapes how we think about all of life. So, for example, some of you may have heard of this sort of theological trend called moralistic therapeutic deism, and it comes from some research actually done by sociologists in the early 2000s. Christian Smith is the big name, who interviewed tons of teenagers, American teenagers, and sort of about what they believe about faith, Christian teenagers, and sort of was able to unearth the fact that most of these teenagers were what he called moralistic therapeutic deists. So deists being that they believe that God is sort of like far off and distant, rather than involved in their life, and that God's general like desire for these teenagers was that they would just be good people. There's the moralistic part, and that God just wants them to be happy, right? Therapeutic. So this is Smith's point was that there's this very therapeutic understanding of faith that had developed. Um, that faith was really, at the end of the day, about them and about feeling good about themselves and how God wanted them to feel good about themselves, right? And so that's an example of how this therapeutic culture we live in makes us look at everything in our life sort of through a therapeutic lens. And I think I've been thinking recently about the how common the language is of good vibes, today, and how I think that's sort of a therapeutic, at the core, is that we want everything to be smooth and to soothe us, right? We want life to go along, smoothly with good vibes, uh, so that we can be happy and all can be well, right? So back to therapy though for a moment. What I've noticed is that over the last 10 years, I've personally sort of noticed a shift in how people approach and talk about therapy. When I was a student 10 years ago, when people encounter situations with mental health, I mean, it was in very hushed tones. Like people didn't really go to therapy, and if they did, they didn't really want anyone to know they were going to therapy. It was very sort of like almost stigmatized and shameful. And over the past 10 years, I've seen this sort of progression where it's gone from having this stigma to sort of being normalized. And now the fact that we can talk about it, and that's a good thing, that it's destigmatized. But then maybe even one step further, is there a moment where it's even glorified and exalted as something that makes you sort of a deep and interesting person who has substance and depth, you know. And so as I'm sort of watching this trend going on here, that fits sort of along with therapeutic culture, I start to put that in conversation with theology now. Okay. And, and I, you know, there's this theologian named Nancy Murphy who makes this claim that, um, that about the gospel that says that our highest good as humans is reached when we renounce ourselves, right? She says self-renunciation for the sake of other people is humanity's highest good. And we can pull out Matthew 10:39, where Jesus says something like, "Whoever would save his life would lose it," right? But whoever would lose his life for my sake will find it. So we have this contrast. On the one hand, we have this therapeutic instinct, which says you're going to flourish when you self-actualize, when you discover yourself, right? And on the other hand, we have this claim that Jesus makes is that it's actually when you deny yourself that you actually realize your potential, right? And you discover who you are. And so these things seem to be in tension with one another. And as much as I love therapy, what I do know is that one thing that a therapist will not tell you is to not deny yourself, right? That very much goes sort of against the grain. And so what do we do with this tension? And so the question that emerged out of all of this, and this is sort of a long intro, but we're getting to the point here, is the big question that I sort of brought to this project is how should Christians think about therapy, right? So as a pastor, I want to be able at the end of the day, when someone comes to me and they're going through a struggle, to be able to tell them whether therapy is the right move for them, whether that's going to be helpful towards their journey through life and through their discipleship as a Christian, or whether there's a time and a place where it actually might not be helpful and it may actually even distract them from the journey that they need to take. So how should Christians think about therapy? So what I did in my project is, and this gets to the practical realm here, is I interviewed 12 students at Baylor University. So they're all students, and they all had expressed that they were struggling with anxiety or depression in some capacity. They had all actually seen a therapist as well at some point, and they chose and opted into doing this study. And I sat with each of them, and actually it ended up being all 12. They were all women, which is probably something about the state of mental health, a point that could be made too. But only women participated in the study, and I sat with these 12 women, and I asked them just questions about their experiences, and I asked them to describe in their own terms what they went through and what it was like and what they got from it, and just really listened and tried to inhabit their world and see things through their eyes, right? And on the one hand, I found exactly what I expected. I found good news that many of these women were being healed and helped through therapy, that it was helping them heal through some trauma that they had endured. It was helping them give more grace to themselves. It was giving them skills for how to work out healthy relationships with one another. And when I hear those things, I say, praise God. God is at work in the midst of this, and this is something to be celebrated. And on the other hand, there was also times and moments where I saw this evidence of this therapeutic culture sort of at work as well. And I saw, perhaps sometimes an over reliance where therapy was thought to solve all of our problems. It was the silver bullet that was going to make everything okay in life and work, perfectly. And kind of ask, where's the room for God in this, in this framework? I saw moments where it was really interesting. The more likely that there's a correlation, the more likely someone was to be an advocate for therapy, the weaker friendships they had in their life. So the stronger friendships that someone had in their life, the less they were likely to rely on their therapist. And so it's sort of an interesting discussion that came up about, is there a replacement that's happening here with people in our life that can be there for us to walk through the struggles that we go through? So some interesting sort of things that developed. So that was the first thing I did, is I did these interviews with these women and asked them questions. The second thing is we had to have sort of a cultural concept that we were studying. And so I studied this idea of therapeutic culture that I've already been talking to you about. But I was reading critical psychology. Okay, so what that means is this isn't like, Christians and theologians who are trying to dig in on therapy. This is psychologists, secular psychologists, who are from within their own world, suspicious of therapy and its own claims, and saying that they're sort of questioning their own sort of worldview, right? And so, what I learned about is that this concept of the self, of that we understand today, our modern concept of the self was actually created in the 19th century. Um, our understanding of what it means to be a self is historically very new. Okay, and so psychology came around sort of with the intention of revealing to us what human nature was like. But in reality, what it did is it actually created the way that we think about what it means to be about a human. That it gave us ways to that humans can be measured and calculated. And so it actually started to shape the way that we thought about what it means to be a self. Okay. It does something to us. And so now all of a sudden we have this suspicion that psychology may not be this sort of neutral thing that we have always maybe imagined it to be, but it's theology laden. There are assumptions within it about human flourishing. It has ideas about what it means to live a good life that are embedded within the discipline itself. And so now we sort of have a little bit, I have suspicion perhaps. Um, and so then thirdly, so there's the interviews, there's the interacting with with psychology itself and its own sort of teachers, and then what can I learn from the scriptures or from my own theological tradition. And so this is where I brought in the idea of kenosis, which is kind of a fancy Greek word, but it is basically the word means emptying. Okay, kenosis is emptying, so it comes from Philippians 2, where it talks about how Jesus emptied himself on the cross. And so the idea is that um, when Jesus went to the cross and took the form of a servant and even to the form of death, right? That there's this contrast that Paul's making in Philippians 2, where he's comparing Jesus and he's comparing Adam. And so Adam took his status as an image bearer of God that he was given, and he sort of warped it to do with it what he liked, right? But on the other hand, Jesus instead empties himself, and he makes himself to be a servant to God, right? So there's this contrast that happens. And what's the scriptures are telling us there is that Jesus is the human that Adam was always meant to be, right? Um, that Jesus puts on full display humanity as Adam was meant to be and as we were meant to be, and yet as we've not been able to be. And yet Jesus shows us what true humanity looks like. And so what comes out of that is this idea that people were made, Jesus shows us, to empty ourselves, that we were meant to renounce ourselves, that's what human nature was meant to be in the very beginning, right? And so when we get to Philippians 2, 3, and 4, and we hear Paul say, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, right? He's calling us to empty ourselves. But here's the even better news, is that this is a command given to a community. It's a reciprocal command. So as I empty myself out for others, they're also being instructed to empty themselves out for me as well. And so the risk that I take on is being absorbed by the community. And so what we have is what I end up calling a kenotic community. It's a community of people called the church who are pouring themselves out for one another, renouncing themselves, right? And yet they don't need to worry about what's happening to them, what will happen to them, because others are doing the same for them as well. And so what I end up doing is sort of comparing this kenotic story, this story of self-emptying that we learn through the Gospels of self-renunciation, with the story of the therapeutic story, which is more sort of inwardly focused and on building and fortifying the self and pursuing, this idea of happiness and satisfaction. And so ultimately, where all this is going, Andrew, in the end, is again, my question is, how should Christians think about therapy, right? And there's a few things that this whole journey sort of teaches me, right? On the one hand, I want to say, oh my goodness, therapy can be a helpful tool. And there are plenty of people that really need it and can benefit from it. It can heal us. It can help us to become more self-aware. It can help us to relate to others better, right? But at the same time, it has some limits. And what it cannot do is help us to discover our true self. And for that, we actually must look to God himself. And when we rely on therapy to do that, to tell us who we are, we're not only looking in the wrong direction for those answers, but we may even be being discipled in the wrong direction into a different story, right? And so instead, what it is becomes as a call to be discerning. And my sort of personal conviction at the moment is that there are certain spaces, at least, where I think therapy may actually have too much cultural currency at the moment, where it has too much influence. Now, I always have to immediately say that in some places that is definitely not the case, that it does not have enough, or people need to be told that it's okay, go get help, and people are there for you to assist you, and you can heal and get past these things and learn to overcome the problems in your life. But in certain places and times, it certainly in certain secular circles has too much cultural currency in this particular moment. And that what I mean by that is that it can't always bear the weight that it was meant to bear. Therapy was not meant to solve all of our problems, and we shouldn't expect that it will solve all of them. And one of those examples would be that it can't replace friendships. That we were all meant to have people in our lives who can walk with us through the difficult things in life. And when we actually take away um, the opportunity from others to walk through that life with us, and turn to a professional instead, we may actually be robbing people from participating in this kenotic community with us, right? Where we're meant to rely on one another and lean on one another. Now, again, there are limits where we need professionals, and that's great, and we're so glad they're there. But whenever possible, let's bring these things to the church. Let's be this kenotic community who's there for one another and develops this sort of reciprocal self-renunciation pattern. Um, and so, anyway, last thought here is at the end of the day, I think that the nature of Christian discipleship, that's what this is teaching me, is that following the way of Jesus is a way of self-emptying. That just as Jesus emptied himself, that we empty ourselves for others, and we do that in a way that sort of builds up the community. Um, and so when we live out this vision that I've been describing as the church, we don't just proclaim good news, that we are good news to the world. We become a witness to them, so that we're hopefully having influence in the world, not just by persuading people with our books, right? But from living a better story, so that they can look at the world, the church, from the outside and see that God is at work here, and there is good news to be found among these people. And so there you go, Andrew. There's my very long, probably too long explanation about what I'm working on, but it kind of all has to fit together. So there's what I've been working on over the last few years.
No, that is perfect. It's not too much. You got a lot of pages that you're writing, so I think you did a good
That's
job
true. That's true.
condensing that down. And I think that's lovely. And it's funny, this is something, not all of this, but that idea of emptying and kenosis is something I've been thinking of a lot lately. And it actually stemmed from me just failing to understand that idea, right? It's a pretty
Yeah.
difficult concept to grasp. And
Yeah.
I think I was kind of like pridefully mad at myself, like, why don't I get this? Like
Yeah.
everybody else. And it's just the funny timing of this. Is this last week we had our reading, and I forget which gospel reading it was, so I'm sorry everyone. But and we were learning about John the Baptist, and my pastor, my priest, made the comment. He was like, of course Jesus is our prime example, right? He is the perfect, the archetype, whatever you want to call him. He's God.
Yeah.
He did it perfectly, and we need to strive to be like Christ, and that's what Paul tells us to do.
Right.
But the usefulness of a guy like John the Baptist, who Jesus said is the greatest man to ever live, right? In terms of
Yeah.
sinners, is John the Baptist is a realistic example. Like we can learn a lot from other humans who have already walked the Christian life and finished the
Absolutely.
race. And John the Baptist was possibly the best example next to Christ, the best
Yeah.
example, a sinner of self sacrificing, of self emptying, and it's just been cool to me to see the connections in that. Where we, our worship is described as a sacrifice, not a grain sacrifice, but a
Right.
sacrifice of ourselves, a
Right.
sacrifice
Our
of praise
bodies.
and
Yeah.
thanksgiving. Yeah, a sacrifice of our bodies. Um, and the one way I like to explain this, and you may or may not agree with this, but I like to tell people the beauty of the Christian life. It's not just that God has a special plan for you. And right, he does. All 8 billion of us, God does have a plan for us. But God has a plan, period. And he's
Right.
inviting us to join it and
Right.
and to be a part of it.
Amen.
And so I don't know. It's just those are the thoughts I've been having. So it's just perfect timing for you to come and
Yeah.
explain the work you've been doing in that area.
Yeah, and put in one verse, like really in really simple fashion. John the Baptist, in John chapter 3, verse 30. I'm going to be preaching on this pretty soon, so it's right on the top of my mind. Simply says this. He says, talking about Jesus, he says, "He must increase, and I
Mm,
must decrease."
yeah.
And that's that kenosis. That's that self emptying of life becoming less and less about you, and yet, the irony in it is that's actually how we flourish. That's actually how we
Mm,
find the good life, is that life doesn't have to be about us. And there's a beauty, there's actually good news in that. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I just have one last question for you then before we close it off. For those listening who are maybe working in churches in ministerial settings, whether vocational or they're just donating all of their time, and they've got the MDiv, they've been in ministry for a few years, they love it, um, and they're maybe considering a doctor of ministry and just kind of starting to get the wheels turning. What would you suggest? What would be some words of advice?
Yeah. One thing that just came to mind, I hadn't thought about this previously, but most doctorate of ministry programs actually require you to have at least 3 years in
Mm,
between completing your MDiv, your master's, and starting on the doctorate. They won't even look at your application until you've are 3 years removed. And I think the point of that is that you need to have some practical experience. And that doesn't mean that you don't, because maybe you do while you're doing your master's, and that's good and good for you. But I think even more, right? And so the idea that you have even more years to reflect upon and to take into your further studies, so that this doesn't become just sort of a purely intellectual or academic sort of thing, but that it finds shape within the actual ministry that you're doing. So one thing for some may just be, okay, you know wait a little bit, and that's
mm,
okay. I think in my cohort, I mean, it was fascinating. I had people. I think I was actually the youngest one, to be honest, in the cohort, because I started in my late 20s. Now I'm in my early 30s. But we had people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s in my
wow.
cohort. So, it could be that it's just never too late, and it could be something that you pick up later in life as well. But if it's something you're interested in, I really encourage you to think about it, because we need theology for the church, and it helps
Mm,
us become better pastors. And so, if I can ever help, if you have any questions about Northern's program, I can definitely answer those. But there are other good ones out there as well. So, just I would encourage you to prayerfully kind of look into that. Yeah,
mm. Awesome. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for jumping on. It was good to see you again and talk with you, and
good to
I'm
see you
glad I
too, man.
got to learn about what you're doing.
Yeah,
Sounds like good stuff.
thanks, man. Good to catch up, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to you later.